B.Ed first year students, Delhi University Department of Education. We are today because of a very generous help offered by History for Peace, interacting with Professor Romila Thapar, who, in that sense, doesn't really need any introduction. But I use this opportunity to encourage my students to pay attention to her work, which is on ancient India. And why the great Emperor Ashoka has become such an interesting figure in Indian history and otherwise. Interesting and important figure, I think. A lot of credit goes to her. And recently, Professor Thapar, they went for a heritage walk with Mr. Sohail Ashmi to Firozshah Kotla, where again they learned about Ashoka's work, and he mentioned your work to my students to gain deeper and deeper understanding. So, history of India, Ashoka, decline of the Mauryas, ancient India, the past and prejudice, ancient Indian social history. There are many such books which I know that my students would have read some of them, and today they will benefit a lot. The point on which we are here together is that our students may be going to become history teacher, English teacher, or physics teacher, or chemistry teacher. But why is it important for them to be aware and excited about history as teachers? That's one agenda. And second thing is that usually a lot of them are taught history in a very misguided format, that history is the study of errors made in the past which we may correct now. So this kind of lot of quality ideas they come up with in this session, they may be hopefully be able to overcome them. Plus they will be able to overcome the idea that past shapes the present, because a lot of your work has been that how in the present we constantly are reorganizing our understanding of the past. So I sincerely hope that they will be intellectually stimulated to read more and see history with a lens of knowledge and not with a lens of perception after listening to you. So I welcome you, ma'am. And in the beginning itself, I express my sincere gratitude for accepting our invitation, and I express my gratitude to Meghaji for organizing this for us. Since it is a new, different batch, so Meghaji, I request you to briefly introduce History for Peace to them, and then we will request Professor Thapar to start.
Thank you, Latika. It's like I've said this to you earlier, that we've been trying to do something with B.Ed students, and this opportunity is really very valuable for our project. I will be very, very brief and request all of you to just please visit our website, historyforpeace.pw. It's a project that we began in 2015, and it's a network for social science teachers across the subcontinent. Although we are focusing more on history, but it is meant for, teachers across the social sciences. What we are attempting to do through this project is bridge the gap between academia and school level teaching, A. B, we are attempting to inspire teachers to bring creative ways of teaching in the classroom, encouraging questioning, developing critical thinking skills, and so on and so forth. So what we do is organize talks, lectures, we organize conferences where we bring together scholars, historians, textbook writers, arts practitioners, students like you together to interact and learn from each other. We develop teaching resources which are made available for download, free download on our website. And that's it. I just, for a deeper understanding of what we do, please visit the website. I don't want to take any longer. We should get on with what we are here for, mainly. So, shall I begin with the questions?
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay, so um, we've kind of clubbed questions together and made 3 or 4 different sections out of it. And to begin with, taking off directly from Latika's brief introduction and the issues that she pointed out, we will start with Professor Thapa. Why is history important for all the teachers, irrespective of their subject specialization? How can we bring history into the classroom while teaching other subjects? Your views on the approach to the teaching of history in the classroom is what the audience here is very keen on hearing about. Shall I also carry on with the rest in this group, or would you like to
No, go through the rest.
go through the rest? Okay. What is evidence in history? How do you judge the reliability of a source in history? Next, we have if history is scientific, why is perspective so important in it? We know that studying the past helps us to understand the present, but should we not also study the present to understand the past better? And last in this section is what history should an average citizen learn, and what history should be taught at the school level to Indian children?
Fine, so now I take over.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, let's begin with this question that one's constantly asked. What is the importance of history? To which there's a very simple answer. It is important because everything has a history. Everything has a past. And I will probably begin with a rather silly example of this to demonstrate how, in fact, everything has a history. When we teach history, we tend to separate political history, which consists of the activities of rulers mainly, queens, kings, battles, events that concern royalty, and so on. But in fact, history as it is conceived of today, and this is really with reference to the major changes that took place in history in the last 30, 40 years, history concerns every human activity. And if you are intelligent in the way in which you look at objects and look at their history, you begin to understand a lot more about the world you live in than you did before. I always say that if every subject that is taught has an opening talk on the history of that subject, how did it come about? What are the inputs? What are the concerns? And how did these change? Then the importance not only of history, but even of the subject would become much clearer. All right, so let me take this example of something that you will all laugh at. My example of every object having a history. The chair that you're sitting on, it has a history. And what do I mean by this? That there is a long tradition of, first of all, when there were no chairs, people sat on the ground. And even to this day, there are some occasions and there are some conditions in which you sit on the ground. Have you asked yourself, why do you sit on the ground for some things? And why do you automatically turn to a chair for other things? There is a difference. There's a history in this. From sitting on the ground, the next elevation was to sit on a mat. You spread a little mat and you sit on it. And if you're meditating, then you take a deer skin or a tiger skin, even better. You spread that out and you sit on that. And you start your meditation. Now, these are not arbitrary things. They've been thought about. And the question that you as young people should ask is, what is the difference between sitting on a deer skin and sitting on a tiger skin? Does this difference have a history? And you will find as you go along that it does have a history. Deer skins were much more easily available, tiger skins were much more valuable, and therefore, as you became more and more important, or as you acquired more wealth, you tended to get yourself a tiger skin and sit on that. From that, from the mat and the tiger skin, you move to sitting on a low stool, what is often referred to in this part of the country as a piri. It's a low stool with 4 little legs, about 6 inches off the ground. And gradually that little stool gets higher and higher and higher until finally you have a stool which is 18 inches off the ground. And this gives you a certain advantage. You're sitting amongst a lot of people and the others are sitting on the ground or they're sitting on these low stools, and you come along with your 18-inch high stool and you're naturally a little elevated, and people start saying, who's that? Why is this person sitting on a higher stool? What is it that gives him the right or her the right to do this? And then gradually your high stool acquires an armrest. You can put your arms on the armrest. It acquires a back. You can lean back. And you can put a cushion at the back, which makes it more comfortable. And then it becomes larger. And then it comes to be decorated. The legs will be shaped and will be colored, and the back will be colored, and there will be a cushion added, and the cushion will be decorated. And it gets to be made of different materials. The cheapest ones are made of cheap wood, but you have some made of more expensive wood. You have some with metal attachments, and you have some with a little carving on the wood or a little painting on the cushions and that kind of thing. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is that every object, therefore, has a historical change. That is, in some periods, you will find it just as a mat. In some periods, you will find it as a little piri, a very small, shallow stool. In some periods, you will find it as a chair. And then when the decoration starts, of course, there are fashions and styles. And therefore, today, you have a lot of value attached to those chairs which were delicately carved and very carefully painted and were used in richer households by the royalty and so on. So we can tell when you look at a chair in a museum, before you actually read the label, you should be able to therefore tell from its shape and its decoration as to the period that it belongs to, and probably the kind of people that used it. In other words, the chair is speaking to you as a visitor, as a viewer. The chair is trying to say to you, I have a history, and you must use your intelligence and understand this history. Now, this is what is a very important aspect of one kind of information that we get in the study of ancient history, particularly ancient and medieval history, what we call archaeology, the study of material culture, the study of objects. Okay, now what do you do with an object then? You just take it as it is and you pay no attention to it? You do that if you're a bored student. But if you're an intelligent student, you ask yourself, what is the function of this object? Has this object changed the way it has looked and in its style over the years? And if it has changed, why has it changed? Why has it become perhaps more beautiful, more decorative, perhaps more ugly even, and more depending on what's available? The point again that I'm trying to emphasize is that every object that surrounds us has a history. Therefore, history is not just looking at a textbook which tells you about kings and queens and battles. History is living with objects and understanding how these objects have become what they have become. So we can study the material culture of the past. We can study the material culture by looking at the objects of the past. And of course, the only way we can do that is by excavation. Either the objects are there. You go into an old house of the 18th century and maybe the beds and the chairs and the furniture are still there. You can actually look at them directly. Otherwise, you dig them up out of an excavation if they're not easily available. But the business of looking at material culture is extremely important. And of course, then historians begin to classify cultures according to the objects that are found. For example, people talk about the Harappa culture. Now, when you say the Harappa culture, it means two things. It means that it refers to a particular geographical location, the site, the place where it was first discovered, Harappa, which is a little village in Pakistan, not far from Lahore. And it also refers to the material culture, which tells you whether it is early or late, whether it is a simple culture or a complex culture. And so the archaeologists will talk about pottery, for example, and they'll always talk about things like PG ware, painted grey ware, or black and red ware, BR ware, or NBP ware, the northern black polished ware. Very important because each of these is attached to a certain kind of culture. And you know that when people talk about NBP ware, they're referring to a certain advanced town urban culture as compared to PG ware, which is a much more rural culture. So that what I'm trying to suggest is that by looking at the history of objects, no matter where the objects are, whether they come out of an excavation or not, particularly if they come out of an excavation, that is an archaeological object, it is both archaeology and texts that give us information about the past. We no longer rely only on text, we use a lot of archaeology as well. And that is something that you as students must be aware of, the importance and significance of archaeology, which has really only developed in the past 1 century. Right, now that is the object. When you talk about what is history, and I tell you every object has a history, and look at the chair also has a history. The other is the text, as I said. This is not an object in itself, it is a written text that refers to events, people, objects, situations, conditions, and so on. Texts are therefore descriptions of how people lived and the values they had and the things they did and the events that took place in their lives. And we therefore have a great deal of reliance on the use of texts. Now, first of all, let me give you a simple description of the kinds of texts that, for example, I use and others working on ancient history will use. We first of all, when we turn to a text, we look at the language and we ask ourselves, what is this language? What period does it belong to? Remember that languages, because they are spoken, they are lived, they're lively, they change over the years. You do not speak the same language as your great-grandfather spoke. Obviously, there's a difference. Similarly, if you go further back in time, the language keeps on changing. And therefore, one clue as to how old a language is to see how much change it has undergone from the early text to now. Secondly, the genre of the text. the kind of text that you're looking at. We, for example, when we study ancient India, look at texts like, first of all, the early texts, the epics. I mean, you often hear people talking about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and they say, but in the Mahabharata it says this, or in the Ramayana it says this. Fair enough, these are texts, these are important texts. But we must also remember that texts, particularly oral texts, texts that begin by being transmitted orally and are written down much later, like the epics, like the Vedic literature and some other texts. Oral texts change a lot as they are handed on, bound to. I remember a game that we used to play as a child. I don't know whether children today play it. You sit in a circle and you whisper something to your left-hand neighbor. You whisper something in the ear of the person sitting to the left of you. And that person, whatever he or she understands, whispers the same thing to her or his neighbor. And so it goes round the whole circle. And when you come to the last person and you say, what did you hear? Sometimes what you hear is totally different from what the first person said. And this is a game which we used to have a lot of fun, because you'd start off by saying something and by the time it got round, it was something quite different. Now remember that the oral tradition is a little bit like that. Of course, people take great care to understand what is being said, to memorize it carefully. Nevertheless, some slippages do take place. And that is actually one of the problems, that you cannot exactly date texts like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, because they have been added to over many periods of time. Sometimes the additions are very clear, sometimes they're not so clear. But for example, the scholars, the Sanskrit scholars who worked on these texts, people like Dr. B.Ed Sukhtankar at the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute, they date the texts, these two epics, to 400 BC to 400 AD. That is, that the composition as we have them now took 800 years. This simply means that there was a story which was added to as it went on. And therefore what we have today is not the original story, but the story with all the additions as well, which is why it takes such a long time. Therefore, it's very difficult to say, this is the date of the Mahabharata, or this is the date of the Ramayana. You have to date the specific section that you're talking about, which is sometimes very difficult to date. How does one recognize epic literature, for example? What is the difference between, let's say, the Mahabharata and the Shakuntala drama, the Natak of Shakuntala, written by Kalidasa? Epic literature, because it was very much oral literature to begin with, has a lot of repetitive phrases. If you read it today, they keep on addressing each other as, oh, bull of the Bharatas, oh, tiger amongst men. This kind of thing is not done in Kalidasa. It's done in the epic. And you know immediately that this is early literature as compared to later literature. You also then have classical drama, of which the play on Shakuntala by Kalidasa is a very fine example of really an excellent, both excellent drama and superb language. I mean, the Sanskrit of this play is really quite beautiful, very poetic and very lovely. That's another category altogether from the epic. They're not the same category of text. They're both great texts in their own genre, as we call it, their own type of literature. Then we also have a very important category of literature called the charitas. And these are the biographies, largely of rulers and sometimes of important people. And these have a different style. They're written in very fine Sanskrit. The language is beautiful, but it's not poetic. It's not like the compositions of Kalidasa. Nevertheless, there's a mix of a little bit of history, where they're describing, after all, the life and activities of a ruler. And there is also a certain amount of poetic imagination, but not too much of it. So that's a different style. The point that I'm trying to make is that when you pick up texts and you say that you're using texts for historical analysis, you cannot treat every text in exactly the same way. You have to identify the kind of text you're dealing with, because each text has its own characteristics. And it's important as a historian that you understand them. Texts are important not only for the narrative that they give you, but more recently, they've also been studied for what they tell you about the age in which they were written. They are what we call witnesses to the age. In the same way as if you see a film today that was made in the 1940s, one of Shantaram's classic films, for example, you laugh because there's a lot there that is rather simplistic when you consider and compare it with films that are made today, which are very sophisticated. There's a difference, and you can tell immediately, and you can say, this was made a long time ago. This is an early film, whereas another one becomes a much later film. Similarly, with literature, you know which kind of text is early and which text is late by the fact that they are telling you about the society. And this may not be done deliberately. When you pick up a novel, a piece of fiction, dealing with everyday life today, what you know is that that piece of fiction will be treated as a kind of image picture of everyday life of the 21st century. And it's not setting out to be a witness, but it automatically becomes a witness by the way in which it is written. And the modern methods of analyzing texts, which are rather different and are a development on an evolution on earlier methods, do take this into account. That this text, if it belongs to a particular period, is it telling us something about the period? And this kind of thinking involves looking at who is the author of the text. The Mahabharata was written by a bard, a singer of stories, a singer of tales. Shakuntala was written by a dramatist. The Harsha Charita was written by a Sanskrit scholar who was not a dramatist. So the authorship becomes very important. The audience is also equally important. Who is it being written for? The poetry of Kalidasa and the Charita literature are written for court circles, people in the royal courts. They appreciate them. The Mahabharata, on the other hand, is written for large gatherings of people. And so it's a different kind of audience. And similarly, the patrons are different. Usually, royal patrons require very sophisticated literature that praises them and says nice things about them. Otherwise, the ordinary poet is just writing about ordinary life. And so there's a difference in that as well. All of this then implies the question of what do we mean by a historical approach? What we mean is that when one is researching history, one is drawing out the significant points of the discipline. If you're writing a narrative of events, you pull out all the references to an event, to people and to events. Then you put them in a chronological order. That is a very important aspect of historical writing. You cannot put late events first and early events late. You have to have them in a chronological order. And then you do the most important thing. You see if there is what we call a causal relationship between one event and another. Did event A lead to event B? Or to put it the other way around, did event B come out of something that was done by event A? This linkage is absolutely crucial to understanding a historical analysis. And this causal relationship is something which is common to every investigation of knowledge, whether it's history, whether it's sociology, whether it's botany, whether it's physics. All knowledge is dependent on causal relationships. What caused something to happen? What caused someone to be the way that person turns out to be? These are all causal relationships and are very, very important. And this is why there are some people who today are suggesting, this might be of interest to you as B.Ed students, that there should be a compulsory course in education called The History of How to Think. How do you derive knowledge? How do you think about that knowledge? What can you make about that knowledge? This is common to everything in education, every subject. It doesn't only concern history, and therefore it would be a very important contribution. So much to what history is about. I'm sorry I've been talking too much. Megha, you must stop me if I'm talking too much.
No, not at all. I mean, it's always fascinating to listen to you.
Right. All right. Then let's come to the question of, if history is scientific, why is perspective so important? Now, underlying this question is the notion that something that is scientific is automatic. This is not so. Even science is based on how you investigate knowledge. It's not automatic. And therefore, the perspective of the investigator is fundamentally important. As important, I would say, as the sources from which that knowledge is being derived. The sources must be complete, they cannot be incomplete, and the investigator must have the ability to analyze and look at every aspect of the problem that is being investigated. Let me begin by saying then that to be scientific does not mean that there is no human control over knowledge, and that knowledge just came along by the way and was picked up by the way by human beings. Not at all. All knowledge is controlled by humans, which is why there are sometimes very strong ethical debates on what kind of knowledge should be made public and what kind of knowledge should not, or who does the controlling of knowledge. If knowledge is controlled, should it be open to absolutely everybody, as indeed it should be, or should there be some people who control it? Now, this is one of the major differences between early periods of history and the modern age. In the early periods of history, knowledge and the writings in which that knowledge was kept were controlled by a certain category of people. The learned people, in the case of India, the high caste people, in the case of China, the mandarins, In the case of Europe, the priests, they all controlled that language. They controlled that language and that knowledge. And the knowledge was controlled by keeping the language to themselves. Therefore, these great classical languages that we speak of, at one level, they are great languages. Linguistically, yes, they're great languages, and their power to express all kinds of things is really quite phenomenal. But don't forget that they're languages that are controlled by some groups of people in society. And the language of the ordinary people is not the language in which this knowledge is being advanced and propagated. In the Indian case, for example, it was Sanskrit in which the knowledge was kept and controlled. The ordinary people spoke Prakrit. And this is very clear if you look at the Sanskrit dramas, for example, where upper caste people and royalty and people of status speak Sanskrit. The women, doesn't matter if they're queens, the women are considered low in status, so they and ordinary people speak Prakrit. The language differentiation is a very strong differentiation. So knowledge is largely kept in this controlled language until recent times, when, again, the great difference between modern society and early society is that today language is available in the language of the ordinary people. So this is a kind of democratization of knowledge. It is a spread of knowledge. It is using knowledge for purposes other than just controlling society, which is the way it was used in the past. Now, scientific thought, what is it concerned with? It's concerned, first of all, with questioning the world. The basic thing about science is that it questions everything around it. The scientist opens up everything to questioning. Secondly, science is concerned with understanding the explanation, giving explanations and understanding what these explanations are. Thirdly, science is concerned with asking questions and then asking further questions. If those questions are not sufficient, you ask further questions. You never have a situation where someone says, now that's enough, you've asked enough questions, now keep quiet. The scientist goes on and on asking questions. That is very important, and that is the way in which there are further investigations. That is the way in which knowledge advances. Please remember that in all bodies of knowledge, whatever they may be, the asking of questions is fundamental. You must ask questions, otherwise you stagnate and your knowledge is totally out of date. You have to ask questions to keep up. What is the method of research that we use? It's rooted then in asking relevant questions. And this has been discussed very interestingly, if any of you are interested. There is a book written by a man called Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn, and it's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And the argument here is that science is not automatic, that the human being sees the connections in science, makes explanations out of these connections. And therefore the human element, the biases, the prejudices, and so on of the human being who's the science, the making these scientific connections is a very important factor, which cannot be set aside. And that explains why there is no such thing as saying, oh, but the facts are there, they speak for themselves. Facts never speak for themselves. People have to make facts speak. And this is, again, a very fundamental thing. Texts do not speak to you themselves. It's how you read them that you understand what they're saying. And you may understand it differently, and your neighbor who reads the same text may understand it differently. And this is part of the difference. So in every subject, again, I come back to my plea, it is necessary to talk about research methods, to talk about questions, how you ask questions, what questions you ask. And you apply it to every discipline, including history, and move away from asking questions only about kings, queens, and battles, and asking questions about every aspect of life. The big change in history, prior to about 50 years ago, history was the narrative of the elite. All history was written about how people at the higher levels of society lived and behaved, what they did, what happened to them, and so on. And the rest were unimportant. Or it was assumed that the life of the elite, however affected the rest, we're not interested. But 50 years ago, history, Indian history in particular, was taken out of what this broad subject that was called Indology, which was simply the study of anything Indian, it didn't matter what. And history was made a part of the social sciences. What change did this bring in? And why is there this big difference now between professional historians who use the methodology of the social sciences and other people, generalists who write history after reading 4 books on the subject, and they will write the 5th book, but not using any research methods and not doing any research in the subject. What was this change that came about in the latter part of the 20th century? The new questions that were asked. The perspective moved from the upper sections of society to the whole of society, middle, lower, the lot, everybody. And so you have this great interest in not just Brahmins and Kshatriyas, but you also had a lot of interest in traders, commerce, who traded, who formed the commercial classes. You had a lot of interest in artisans. Who were the artisans? Where did they carry out their professions? In towns, in villages? What was their status? What was their relationship? Similarly, peasants. The peasants are out in the rural countryside. What is their relationship with other people as well? So the new questions included new sections of society, which was a big change. Secondly, there was a considerable impact, considerable emphasis on technology. What changes a society? Thinking, yes. Ethics, yes. But also the technology that is used. And this makes enormous changes, for example, in the production of goods. If you weave in a particular way and you can improve your weaving methods, you produce better cloth. If you cultivate in a particular way and you improve your cultivating methods, you produce a better crop. So something like irrigation systems come into existence. And irrigation systems are, of course, prevalent all over, from simple things like well irrigation and channels to canal irrigation and anicuts and dams and all that, very complicated systems. So technology became a very important part of historical inquiry. And also the simple things like what were the activities of people? If they were learning, where were they learning? What were schools like? What were they being taught? Where did this learning take place? Reading, writing, and arithmetic was taught in schools, but technical training was all on the job. You were apprenticed, which is a different system altogether from the system that exists today. So remember that when you're studying the totality of a society, you're studying a rather different kind of society from the one in which you were born and grown up in. There is a difference, and you have to be aware of that difference when you're studying history. We study history from sources, generally, as I said, texts or archaeological evidence. And historical sources, therefore, were subjected to the same questions that were being asked by other social sciences. You have to know the details of every society. How does each group in society relate to another group? How are they judged? What is the status given to them? How are they treated? Extremely important. And then there are other aspects that slowly and gradually come into historical analysis. What were the rules of governing and administration? What were the taxes? Very important. Who was taxed? How much were they taxed? Was there a general tax? Were there specific taxes? This is something, I mean, taxes is something that your parents are paying today. So you should be interested in what your ancient ancestors might have been paying at some stage. Which levels of society are we talking about, since the levels differ? Governing, administration, the top levels is very different from the lower levels. And what are the different economic activities that were carried out? What were the social levels in society? Did their rules vary? For example, marriage rules, very interesting. Elite groups have certain marriage rules. People, they can marry and they can't marry, what's known as exogamy and endogamy. Lower caste people have totally different rules. People in northern India have rules. People in southern India have different rules. In the Vedic texts, for example, one of the distinctions they say between the northern and the southern Brahman is that the Brahmins of the south can marry the uncle's daughter, Mamu ki ladki, which the northern Brahmins could not do. So these are all very interesting things, not simply because they're curious and they're interesting rules, but they are reflections on how a society is organized. Marriage rules are very important to understanding how a society is organized and what the values of that society may be. If the marriage rules are all suppress the women, then you know what the values of that society were. But if there are rules that say, no, women should be given equal status in a marriage, then it's a different kind of society. So do remember that all these seemingly unimportant things are very important. Inheritance, who inherits? There's a whole text after text on the question of inheritance, which is very important, even in law. Occupations, who performs what occupations? Rituals, who performs which rituals? Not everybody can perform every ritual, or in the past they couldn't. Now, of course, it's much easier. What languages do they speak? The elite speaks a different language from other people. Sometimes there's a whole hierarchy of languages with different people at different levels speaking these different languages. So remember that society is not just royalty and the court and those of upper status. Even the elite that I'm talking about has a whole range of people. The court, the wealthy traders, the heads of religious institutions. Remember that religious institutions in the past also were extremely wealthy. A lot of the wealth in taxes, in pilgrimage donations, in royal patronage went to such groups of people. So these are all part of the elite. We only think of royalty, but it's a very widely set out set of people. And then you have institutions that are very wealthy: monasteries, temples, masjids, khanqahs, the Sufis, gurdwaras. They're all patronized. Not all, but most of the bigger ones, the special ones, are patronized by the wealthy. So you have an extensive group of people that form the elite, and the historian is interested in studying how this group changes from early times to later times, and a change takes place, an evolution takes place. Then you have the non-elite, which consists of groups like the artisans, the peasants, the laborers, the servants of the elite, and generally other people who perform jobs. When you perform a job for another person, in a sense, you become part of this group. What is the status of each of these? How is the status arrived at? Why is a particular group of a higher status than a lower status? There has to be an explanation for that. You accept the status, but then you have to explain as a historian why this comes into existence. What is the relationship of one group to the other? And who controls and orders this relationship? Royalty, texts like the Dharma Shastras that control caste relationships, occupations, practical relationships. And who punishes people when the rules are broken? This is equally important as observing the rules. Who has the right? Who has the right in the legal system to punish those who break the rules? We then come to the question of what history should an average citizen learn? Clearly, the citizen must know the significant features of his or her own history. You start with me, myself, my family, my neighborhood, the group that I belong to, my biradari, my community, and then it gets wider and wider as you go along. So it begins with understanding, trying to understand how you fit into the wider history. That's an interesting way of trying to learn history. You have the history of the subcontinent, yes. It's a bit abstract, it's vague. There is something called the subcontinent. You can't touch it or feel it or anything, but it's there. It's an idea. How do you as a citizen fit into the subcontinent? This is a very fundamental historical question, which our constitution has been trying to answer, which the law courts occasionally try to answer, but which is very important to the study of the past and the present. How do I fit in to this subcontinent? One major change. None of the kingdoms of India in the past, pre-colonial period, ever coincided with the entire subcontinent. Even the Mauryan state, the southern end was left out, and certainly in the Mughal period too, much of the peninsula was left out. The entire subcontinent never fitted into these earlier kingdoms. It's therefore a new thing. It's a new entity. And even now, of course, it's not the entire subcontinent because bits have broken off. But even what we have, it is important to remember that boundaries have continually changed. The boundaries in the past of India were made and were changed as dynastic history changed. So we do not expect to impose our present day boundaries on the past. But here again, what is interesting for the historian is to say, so all right, there was these multiple boundaries. And what were the periods of history in which these multiple boundaries existed? There were multiple kingdoms, and then gradually they coalesced, they came together, they joined together, they were conquered, or whatever it was. And you had fewer kingdoms. Then again, they broke up and there were many kingdoms, and then there were periods when they came together and became fewer. And it's really not until you come to the colonial period that there is an attempt to bring all these parts of the subcontinent together into one nation. So when you are studying the history of the subcontinent, please remember two things. One is ecological diversity. The subcontinent is not the same everywhere. It is ecologically very, very different, geographically different, and you have to keep that in mind when you're studying. And secondly, cultural diversity, which is expressed through basic things like language, like religion, like the sense of community, the kind of community you belong to, and the region that you identify with. Each community identifies with a particular region. Remember, of course, historically, that these identities of communities were smaller identities. They weren't these huge subcontinental identities, which really have grown up now with modernization. We have to also understand something else, which is that borders in the old days were very fluid. There were no maps, so you couldn't draw a red line and say this is the border between this country and this country. We had what were called frontier zones. Two kingdoms come close together and there is a zone between them, which is the frontier zone, which is a vague kind of zone in which each kingdom is playing a role, helping, interfacing with the other kingdom. So there was a lot of this crossing over of frontier zones that went on with migrants. And migration plays an extremely important part in history, in any history, anywhere. Particularly in the history of things like trade and the history of cultural change. Migration is an extremely important factor. So what do you teach the average citizen? You teach them their own history, the history of the community. You teach them the history of the region, which is very important. And when you teach them the history of the subcontinent, you teach them the diversity as well as what it is that binds the subcontinent together. Not as an absolute for all time, but certainly for something for our times, which is keeping us all together and which is to be valued. I think I'll stop there for that bunch of questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Thapar. I mean, it's, every time I listen to you, first of all, I must say I regret not having studied history.
But it's not too late. You need to study.
Yeah, and also it's the one thing that really comes across from this section of what you've spoken about, particularly when you're talking to aspiring teachers, is this strong link between the teaching of history and developing of curiosity in children. And I really wish that our classrooms would exploit that. Your example of the chair talks very strongly about that. If children were to start looking at every single object around them and start asking questions about their origin, in so many ways, the mental development would be at another level altogether.
Yeah.
So shall we? Sorry.
I'm a great believer in asking questions.
Yes.
That's what education is all about. It's to teach students how to ask questions and encourage them to go on asking questions.
Yes, absolutely. So shall I move to the next set of questions? Yeah. Okay, this is a very, very ongoing pertinent concern, some of this with practicing teachers. Popular history has always had a strong impact on lay audience. Non-academic writers like William Dalrymple, with their interesting That's just one example, of course, with their interesting and readable mix of historical fact and creative imagination. Biopics, films on historic subjects, television programs, web series, all of these have captured the public discourse and the wider imagination. Some of these we know also have distorted historical events. So, is historical memory an aspect of imagination? One. How does the relation between imagination, perspective, the present, and history play out? How does one reconcile creative freedom and distortion of history? And how do we train teachers and children to distinguish between the two?
Yeah, that's a tough set of questions. But let's see. First of all, you have to understand that the reason why you're studying history is to enable you, why you're studying history, not just reading it, but studying it. It's to enable you to make a distinction between facts and fantasy, fact and fiction. It's not always easy, and sometimes we have a preference for saying, oh, I prefer the fiction, so let's stay with the fiction and forget about the fact. But this is a very fundamental distinction. Not necessarily, you don't have to apply it to everything, but you have to be aware of it. And that is really all that the historian is asking. Do not confuse fact with fiction. Do not say this is history when it's not history. Go ahead and do what you like. But remember to say that this is your fantasy. It is not history. That is what we are asking for. Historical facts are dependent on sources. What do we mean by sources? Texts, objects, anything that can provide evidence of a period of study must be relevant to the person and the period. You cannot use a source of 1,000 years ago to refer to the present day, or something that happened. If I go back to my earlier example of the Mahabharata, for instance, which is written over a long period of time, you cannot use evidence from a text like that and apply it, let's say, to the 15th century AD or something of that kind. In other words, there has to be a certain respect for chronology. And by this, I mean that if you are talking about a particular period of history, for goodness sake, keep your sources to what is written in that period or what is written about that period. Don't jump to other periods and use other kinds of sources. So whether it is politics or culture, the source has to be as contemporary as possible. And this is where we run into great problems, historians versus the general public, when the historian is insisting on the viability of fact and the general public really doesn't care and says, doesn't matter, it says so in such and such a book, it holds for all time. That's not so. Secondly, when you decide to call something a fact, whether it's historical or scientific or whatever it may be, you have to be sure that you have checked for its reliability. That's very, very fundamental. You can't fantasize about something and say this is how it happened because you haven't checked the reliability. There is a hierarchy in the text that you can use for this question of reliability. There's a difference, for example, between the Kautilya Arthashastra, which is a text on political economy written again over a long period of 600 years, It's semi-historical in the sense that it does refer to a historical situation. And it makes a statement of how a good government should function. So it's partly historical and partly analytical about a good government. That's one kind of text. Then you have an inscription recording events in the reign of a king, which begins by saying such and such a king of such and such a dynasty who ruled in this period of time, went to war against X, Y, and Z, and won the war and conquered the territory. Now, this is meant to be a record of something that actually happened. This is historically acceptable, as far as we know, to historians, unless it is cancelled by some other similar source. I mean, if another inscription comes along saying quite the opposite, then the historian is in a quandary and doesn't know which inscription to believe. But at least something like a record of an event that takes place at the level of the state and the court is a more historical fact than something which isn't. As, for example, Kalidas's Shakuntala again, which is pure fiction. It's very difficult to talk about these events having happened because there's no evidence to back that. There's no evidence to support the events having happened. Then you have to consider the author of the text. For example, in the early period, we have texts that come out written by Brahmin authors and by Buddhist authors. Each has his own bias, and you have to be aware as a historian of what this bias might be. This applies not only to ancient authors like Kautilya or Buddhaghosa or any of those people. It also applies to modern historians. We all have our biases. Some of us try and control our biases. Some of us give expression to our biases, and some of us pretend we don't have them, but in fact we have them. So when you read a text, a historical interpretation, you have to say, you can only go by the reliability of the evidence quoted, which is why some people get laughed at by historians because they have no evidence for what they have to say, which I'll come to later on. Okay, so the author has to be known. The author's biases and prejudices have to be known. The reasons for the author having taken up the writing of a particular book would help if they were known. The audience, again, has to be known. Who is the book written for? The court, as in the case of Kalidas's Shakuntala, or is it written for popular gatherings, for example, at a pilgrimage center? There's a cross-section of people who attend, and so the bard or the poet comes along and tells a story. This can be entirely fictional. The audience is different. The requirements of the audience are different. And most important, what is the purpose of the text? Is it just to entertain, like Shakuntala? So it's fictional, beautifully written, very entertaining. Is it a religious text where it is preaching something, it's propagating a religion, propagating ideas, like, or describing religious rituals, as in the case of, for example, many hymns of the Rig Veda and later Vedic texts that are describing the rituals that have to be performed? Is it a didactic text that tells you what is to be done? The Dharma Shastras. How does caste society behave? What are the rules of caste society? Or the Kautilya Arth Shastra. What is meant by good government? How should a king behave? How should the ministers behave? Etc., etc., etc. So the purpose of the text is very important, because the purpose of a text gives a certain direction to the text, which it need not have otherwise had. Now, you can treat fictional, semi-fictional, semi-historical texts in interesting ways historically. For example, I did a study of the entirely fictional story of Shakuntala in a comparative way. How is it told in the Mahabharata? How does Kalidas tell it? How is it told in Braj Bhasha at the court of Awadh in the 18th century? How is it translated into European languages, and what kind of reception does it have in Europe? Now, this is not to prove anything about the historicity of the text. I start off by saying it is entirely fictional. But can this text, these series of texts on the same story, if correctly and fully analyzed, can they tell us something about social attitudes towards women as the story focuses on? And there are differences quite clearly between the Mahabharata version and the Kalidasa version, the Rajbhasha version, and the translation by William Jones and by various other European writers, and its reception. Also in the world of Bombay Talkies, the film that was made in 1943, I think it was, on Shakuntala. And that has a slightly different orientation. Now, what I'm trying to suggest is that these texts have a historical context. They are written at particular periods of time. They have a historical background. And therefore, one can derive a certain amount of historical information from them, not in terms of did these events actually happen or not. We know they didn't happen. We know they're fictional. But what is the indication that the text is giving you about the nature of society at that time? This you can get fairly obviously from the different ways in which these texts have been composed. So that's one way in which one can use the sources. But let me repeat that it is absolutely necessary, essential, to insist that there is a difference between what is factual and what is fiction. It is equally necessary to say both are legitimate in their own context. If you're looking for entertainment, you're looking for something that is fictional. But if you're looking for something that is telling you about the way things were in earlier periods, then you're looking for history, which cannot be fictional, it has to be factual. And it is necessary, therefore, to keep both these quite separate. Then the question of, is historical memory an aspect of imagination? There's a lot of work that is being done on memory and history, memory and history these days. And it also brings in a new kind of source, which we refer to as the oral tradition. Memory has been studied by psychoanalysts who've suggested ways of exploring further and cross-checking memories. And this has been a subject of great interest in Europe and the United States, where there is also a branch of history called psychohistory, where you take up the life of an important person and you try and reconstruct that life in terms not just of the day-to-day events that happened, those have their own role, but why the person behaved in a particular way. In other words, you try and psychoanalyze that person. Fortunately, it can only be done by people who live in modern times, because we don't have these biographical details of people who lived earlier in ancient times. But anyway, that is one way of combining memory and history. Let me give a little time to oral history, which is related and is very important today. It is being studied in depth. It was earlier dismissed. Earlier it was said, unless something is written, you cannot take it seriously. But now that position is changing, and people are saying that there are certain kinds of oral traditions that do have a historical basis. And how can we discover this? Through using various techniques of analysis. Much has been written on the epics of Eastern Europe, for example, and how they can be analyzed. And some of this material is parallel to the work that is being done on the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, also from similar points of view. And this is, of course, pertinent to the study of the Indian epics, which were written, as I said, over a long period, chronology of 800 years. So the later sections of the epic would have been composed in Mauryan and post-Mauryan in historical times. And this disagrees. The problem arises that in the Puranic literature and some of the other literature, there's a tendency to push the epics back to the earliest period and take them back to about 3102 BC, which really is not based on any kind of factual analysis of the texts. It is simply a date that is allotted to them. And one runs into problems with public opinion that goes on saying, but they date to the 4th millennium BC. How can you say that they date to this much later period? And this is where the whole question of factual evidence versus fiction is absolutely central. The problem with using memory is also related to working out the techniques that are used to test memory. Memory is not like an inscription. It is not a record on stone. It changes with age. You're all young, but once you get to my age, you realize the problems that you will have remembering what happened in your younger years. And maybe if you ask your grandmother to narrate an event, she will narrate it in one way today, and next month there will be a slight change. There will be a little change in the narrative, which is perfectly acceptable because that's the way memory works. Remember that memory is a question of remembering only what you wish to remember. There's quite a lot of suppression that goes on with memory, and therefore it's a slightly problematic kind of source for historians. Memory also depends a lot, not on an actual fact, but on hearsay. If when you were young, people kept saying something repeatedly all the time, as you grow older, you come to think of that as having happened in the way in which it is related. It's different from a personal experience. Although even a personal experience, as you will all understand when you're middle-aged, can change. Your memory of a personal experience can change as you grow older. And the third aspect, which is very important, is who are you narrating it to? Because in order to make your memory explainable, explicable to your audience, you sometimes vary the way in which you relate that memory. So the audience of the memory is as important as all of these. Now, the easiest way to test memory is, of course, if you get confirmation from another source. I mean, the kind of thing that happens is that if you say a certain segment of a text is based on memory, and you suddenly come across an inscription that says exactly the same thing, then there is a tendency for the historian to say, well, that memory must be correct because the inscription is repeating it. So support from another source is very, very important to validating memory. Let me just add at this point that if any of you are interested in following this up, there's been a lot of work done in Africa, south of the Sahara, Black Africa, as they say, the area where the Bantu languages are spoken. There's a lot of work done because there's nothing but oral history available in some of those areas. And so in the absence of written sources, people have worked on that. And oral history is now beginning to have quite a respectability, as it were, provided, of course, it's done with reference to the techniques that I mentioned, provided those techniques are employed. Remember that all analysis has methods, and therefore when you say, I'm using such a thing as a source, you have to add that you're using certain methods for analyzing that source as well. Okay, now we go on to section 3.
Latika, do we have time for the third section, or?
I would go by Professor Thapar's energy levels, whatever she says. We could postpone the remaining questions for Saturday as well, because it's already close to 5:30.
Oh, okay.
So it's up to you, Romila. Do you want to?
Why don't we start with the third section on Saturday, and then
Okay.
I'll go faster. I'm sorry.
No.
That's perfectly fine. Yeah.
This is my
That's
problem.
perfectly fine.
Once I start talking, I go on talking.
Well,
And it was perfect. There was absolutely no problem in that. Any quick questions from students? Smriti, Shreya, Shivani, Sakshi.
I think they're absorbing the wealth of
Yes.
ideas that they have just heard.
I will open it for them on Saturday as well. I won't be as rigid like an ancient king. I won't draw boundaries. So if they have questions, I'll allow them to join on Saturday as well, and they can ask then.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot, ma'am, and thanks a lot, Meghaji. It was wonderful to listen to you so coherently and so slowly. If you go fast,
You
then
must tell
the
me.
idea is good.
No, you must tell me if there are things that are not clear, because I can then clear them on Saturday.
Fine. So if I will go over the talk, and if there is anything, then I will get back to you before Saturday. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everybody. See you on Saturday.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. See you again Saturday.
Yes.
No. How does one go out of here?